I am Peter Lee for Newsbud's China Watch. This week on China Watch, know your enemy, not China, Xi Jinping. America's confrontation with the People's Republic of China is heating up. Not just the trade war and the 25% tariffs on $200 billion in Chinese goods announced by Donald Trump. Not just the release and promotion of an ultrahawk Pentagon assessment of China's military capabilities. The real sign we're getting serious about China is the appearance of the designated boogeyman, Xi Jinping, to personify elite U.S. anxiety and anger concerning China. Per a New York Times op-ed, Xi Jinping wanted global power. He overshot. Washington Post, how Xi overplayed his hand with America. Little further down the food chain, Tom Rogan wrote in the Washington Examiner, Chinese President Xi Jinping intends to destroy the U.S.-led international system of fair commerce under the democratic rule of law. He aims to replace it with one of intellectual theft and feudal mercantilism. Indeed, Xi Jinping has instituted a cult of personality and abolished term limits for the largely symbolic Chinese presidency so he can serve indefinitely and become a focus of national unity beyond the collective leadership model. So he deserves some of these criticisms. However, it looks to me like the U.S. focus on Xi Jinping has more to do with ratcheting up adversarial propaganda in order to personify our hostility to China into one easily identifiable symbol. This framing presents the alluring myth that our problems are just this one evil guy. You know, like Putin, like Maduro, Kim Jong-un, Assad, Gaddafi, Saddam, Duterte. Am I leaving anyone out? Oh yeah, Castro, Ortega, Khomeini, Ahmadinejad, Allende. Almost forgot Noriega and Milosevic. It's also designed to deliver the message to the easily deluded inside China that if they turn on Xi Jinping, it's all going to be back to buttercups and moonbeams with the United States. So you've got a psyop targeting Chinese opinion in addition to an agitprop campaign targeting the as-yet China war unenthusiastic U.S. public. As the Spectator put it, our real problem with China, Xi Jinping. Long story short, if you're reading a story that should be about China, but instead it personifies China as Xi Jinping, it's safe to assume it's an op cobbled together by the Pentagon and the CIA and propagated by a small army of cooperative journos. The crisis in U.S.-China trade negotiations has been revealing as to U.S.-China hawk attitudes and intentions. On one level, the crisis is standard issue Trump. The Chinese are anxious to make a deal, so a deal is almost done. Trump, on the other hand, isn't too anxious because the markets are absorbing the trade war news without crashing, U.S. growth is good, unemployment is low. That's a signal to Trump that he can pull the rug out from under the Chinese by declaring the negotiations are in trouble and screw out some more concessions from the Chinese. Art of the deal, middle finger edition. On another level, stalling and stringing out the negotiations pleases a major Beltway constituency, the China hawks. They see a trade crisis as a major boost to their plans to decouple the U.S. and Chinese economies. Tariff stress and Chinese retaliation will encourage more U.S. companies and international investors to break links with China and move production and money to safer homes in East and South Asia and maybe even back to the United States. The most aggressive and vocal anti-China hawks, typified by Steve Bannon, have called for not even pretending we want a trade deal and instead moving on to open economic warfare with the People's Republic of China. Steve Bannon, we're in an economic war with China. It's futile to compromise. Not only does this weaken the People's Republic of China economically, it quarantines China from the West, making a pure containment and confrontation strategy easier and less costly to implement. The Chinese Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping had absorbed the lesson that the USSR fell because of its isolation, and China conducted a wildly successful campaign to embed the People's Republic of China into the international system instead. The US-China hawks are determined to break that link, or at least weaken it enough so that there will be minimal Western opposition to US economic and military warfare against China. In addition to the civilian trade thing, the Pentagon is using its coercive levers to persuade businesses and universities to sever their links with the PRC if they want to keep feeding at Uncle Sam's Millsec Trough. And if you think liberals and progressives might be standing up for engagement and multilateralism, forget about it. It turns out American hegemony has been the real psychological crutch for Americans of all ideological stripes since the end of World War II. And Democratic politicians are just as eager as their Republican counterparts to take on China and keep America on top. Here's what uber-progressive Matt Stoller had to say on Twitter. A Chinese order is terrifying. There really is a global struggle for freedom beginning. So, it is my assumption that underneath the back and forth of the trade negotiations, decoupling of the United States from the People's Republic of China will grind on in every sector. Not just punitive trade and investment policies, also in escalated cyber warfare, witch hunts in academia, and exclusion of PRC-backed outlets from the U.S. media sphere. As to where all this leads, it probably leads to the Philippines and Taiwan. When China was just a cute little communist panda, well, an impoverished Chinese panda unable to project power into the Pacific, the United States gave up 2 of its precious pearls from the so-called First Island Chain Necklace of China containment, Taiwan and the Philippines. In 1978, the United States withdrew its Military Assistance Advisory Group from Taiwan as part of the normalization process with the People's Republic of China. In 1992, in the wake of the Marcos unpleasantness in the Philippines, the United States military was ordered to vacate a massive naval base at Subic Bay and its Clark Air Force Base. The Pentagon has yearned to return to the Philippines and Taiwan ever since, and the economic and military rise of China and its assertiveness in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait has created a much more favorable set of conditions for the United States. A formal U.S. military alliance with an independent Republic of Taiwan might be the Pentagon's ultimate prize, but the Taiwan project is still a work in progress. The pro-U.S. DPP party holds the presidency in Taiwan, but its policy of pivoting away from engagement with the mainland and toward Japan and the United States does not yet have a lock on public and electoral sentiment. The DPP and its friends in the Pentagon and Japan are gearing up for a rather desperate fight for the presidential elections in 2020. The DPP got totally waxed in their midterms this year, and there is genuine anxiety that Taiwan voters might pivot back to the mainland-friendly KMT party, or, almost as bad, re-elect Tsai with much less than a mandate to continue the standoff with Beijing. Declarations that any electoral outcome favoring the pro-engagement KMT are illegitimate, thanks to PRC's subversion and Infowar manipulation, are virtually preordained in DPP circles and in America's think tankistan. In fact, accusations have already surfaced and also serve as the template for the anti-Chinese influence campaigning in Australia and the United States. But all in all, the battle to gain Taiwan for America looks to be rather difficult. Things might go better in the Philippines. The current president, Rodrigo Duterte, is wildly popular inside the Philippines, even though he is execrated in pro-U.S. international circles as a China-appeasing, murdering lout. But Duterte's termed out, and there will be a new president elected, same as Taiwan, in 2020. Maybe Team America can get a pro-U.S. candidate in there, maybe they can't, but in any case, whoever it is will probably have less stroke than Duterte. The Philippine military, on the other hand, isn't going anywhere, is staunchly pro-US, and is already working with its counterparts in the Pentagon to push the Philippines into the China confrontation space. In recent weeks, the Philippine Minister of Defense, Delfin Lorenzana, obtained a public affirmation from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty would cover any attack on the Philippine military in the South China Sea. Then, anti-China litigators obtained a favorable ruling from the Philippine Supreme Court ordering the government to protect the environment at Scarborough Shoal. That's an unoccupied landform controlled by China and a longtime flashpoint for Chinese-Philippine friction in the South China Sea. It also told the Philippine government to protect the environment at Mischief Reef, which is a totally man-made island created by the Chinese island-building operation within the Philippine 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Top Philippine court orders government to protect South China Sea. And the Philippine Navy joined Japan, India, and the United States for what it called a joint transit exercise in the South China Sea. So, what do we have here? We have a constitutional charge for the Philippine government to protect landforms controlled by China in the South China Sea, formal U.S. backing for the Philippine military in case of a clash with China in the South China Sea, and the Philippine Navy joining the U.S.-led China Containment Alliance in operations in the South China Sea. Things could get interesting if Duterte's successor as president in 2020 decides to put all these pieces in motion together. How interesting? Fortunately, not this interesting. Lorenzana rejects proposal for Philippines to develop nuclear weapons. But things might get interesting enough that the People's Republic of China might withdraw from a major international treaty. That's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known by its initials as UNCLOS or UNCLOS. In the previous episode of China Watch, I discussed an interesting gambit by the PRC to use UNCLOS to demand that foreign warships avoid the Taiwan Strait. UNCLOS states that if a continental state also controls an island, it can demand that warships engaged in innocent passage not use the strait, and instead take an alternate route. In the case of Taiwan, this would mean warships could be required to sail up the eastern or Pacific side of Taiwan on the way from point A to point B instead of using the Taiwan Strait. That is, if everybody accepted that Taiwan is indeed sovereign territory of the People's Republic of China. Unfortunately for the PRC, that is not the case. Most nations follow the lead of the United States in acknowledging that the People's Republic of China is the sovereign power on the Chinese mainland, but not sovereign over Taiwan. So, look for the United States to continue to sail up and down the Taiwan Strait and, in fact, persuade other navies to come along to humiliate the PRC and demonstrate the limits of its power. You can add to that the fact that the United States Navy has declared it has no obligation to respect any 12-mile territorial sea when the territory of an island is disputed, as many of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea are. And now, China faces the threat that the Philippine government, backed by the U.S. military, will seek to enforce its environmental protection obligations on landforms controlled by China in the South China Sea, as specified in the UNCLOS arbitration award to the Philippines concerning PRC claims in the South China Sea. All in all, UNCLOS has turned into a pretty big liability for the PRC in its confrontation with the United States and U.S. allies. Therefore, it is not too surprising that the idea of China withdrawing from the UNCLOS regime is being floated. This possibility was raised in a piece for The Diplomat by Mark Valencia, a consultant to the PRC government who has also written in the international press on the Taiwan Strait issue. Might China withdraw from the Law of the Sea Treaty? Analysis. Withdrawing from a major international treaty would not be a good look for the PRC, especially as it is fighting U.S. characterization of China as a rogue state. But the countervailing argument is that the United States itself is not a signatory to UNCLOS, and PRC withdrawal would level the playing field with the United States. by allowing China to unilaterally declare its interpretations of its obligations instead of subjecting itself to the mercies of UNCLOS and its dispute resolution system. In other words, behave just like Uncle Sam does. Call it superpower parity. Valencia wrote, China would then be legally free to pick and choose the convention's provisions and interpret them in its favor, just as the U.S. does now. China's withdrawal from the convention would weaken it and the authority of its dispute settlement mechanism. China may welcome that as it seeks to alter the interpretation of international law in its favor. At the least, it would give notice that China is not to be trifled with. And it would also give the PRC more latitude to play hardball on the Senkakus and offshore oil concessions disputed with the Philippines and Vietnam, including the vital Reed Bank energy play off the Philippine coast. It's not a pretty scenario, and that's the whole point. The PRC is hinting it's willing to get pretty ugly if its maritime neighbors keep following the U.S. playbook. How bad will things get? Well, how bad things get will probably be a function of how the elections in the Philippines and Taiwan go. So, mark your calendars for a possible war in 2020. Finally, Australia. Apparently, in 2009, the Australian intelligence community decided its ticket to the big time would be tag teaming with the United States on the China threat. The threat specifically being that Australian politicians would decide that economic engagement with China made more sense than a MilSec alliance with the United States against China. Australia was an early adopter on the U.S. ban on Huawei, the telecommunications company. Australia consulted with the United States to roll out foreign influence laws applied against penetration by PRC-leaning individuals in Australian politics, business, and academia, and Australia worked with the United States to try and roll back PRC influence in Australia's Polynesian backyard, including Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. A decade ago, lining up with the United States to stomp on China must have seemed like a no-brainer for Australian spooks. It was the best way, maybe the only way, to ensure the continued clout and relevance of a second-tier European colonial enclave, ill-equipped to face the demographic, economic, and military challenge of rising Asia. But it hasn't quite worked out that way. Australia, instead of leading the charge of the Caucasian democracies into Asia to roll back the Chicoms, is finding itself alone at the end of a rather long and shaky limb. Australia and the United States are the only members of the Five Eyes American-led surveillance consortium supporting a full Huawei ban. The UK, Canada, and New Zealand, despite intense US pressure, haven't opted in. New Zealand went so far as to sign on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Papua New Guinea is cultivating its China ties even as it sucks in cash from the United States and Australia. There's a slowdown in Australian exports to China that's probably politically driven. In response to this rather dismaying turn of events, after a couple years of strident and continual anti-Chinese rhetoric driven by the Australian security agencies and their allies in the local media, now China has been virtually invisible as an issue in the upcoming Australian parliamentary elections, which might result in a switch from Liberal to Labour rule. Not because China isn't an issue, it's because both parties see little benefit in raising the issue and making matters worse. The biggest China noise out of Australia in recent weeks, ex-Prime Minister Paul Keating of the Labour Party. He ripped the security agencies for leading Australia into a geopolitical dead end on China, declaring, "When the security agencies are running foreign policy, the nutters are in charge." That wasn't all, as the Daily Mail's headline tells us. Australia's security agencies are run by nutters who have been going Burko, that's Australian for berserk, at the Chinese since a journalist wrote a report for ASIO, that's the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, on their influence, says XPM. Well, there you have it. I think Australia, or at least Paul Keating, has finally got it right. Maybe it's not too late for Australia or us. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching, and thank you for supporting Newsbud and China Watch, 100% people-funded independent media by and for the people. See you next time. I am Peter Lee for Newsbud's China Watch.